This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin our investigation, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. In the autumn of 1912, along the banks of the Ogeechee River in Bryan County, Georgia, there existed a house that the locals referred to only as the Whitmore place. It sat approximately 7 miles northeast of Way's Station, accessible by a narrow dirt road that wound through longleaf pine forests and past remnants of rice fields that had fallen into disrepair decades earlier. The property had once been prosperous, one of the many agricultural holdings that dotted the coastal plain of Georgia during the antebellum period, but by the early 20th century, it had transformed into something else entirely. The main house was a 2-story structure of weathered cypress and brick, built sometime in the 1840s, with a veranda that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that seemed to watch the surrounding marshland with perpetual suspicion. When I first encountered records of this property during my research into coastal Georgia histories, I did not anticipate that they would lead me down such a troubling path. The woman at the center of this account was named Cordelia Vickers, a 34-year-old widow who had arrived at the Whitmore residence in late September of 1912 to serve as the head maid. According to documents I located in the Bryan County Historical Archives, Cordelia had previously worked for a family in Savannah for nearly 8 years before their household dissolved following a financial scandal. She came to the Whitmore place with strong references and a reputation for discretion. What she encountered there, however, would test the limits of what any person should be expected to endure in silence. The Whitmore household at that time consisted of Phineas Whitmore, a 67-year-old retired naval supplies merchant, his wife Opaline, and Opaline's unmarried sister, Lavinia Marchmont, who had lived with the couple for approximately 15 years. There were also 2 other servants on the property, a cook named Bessie Haywood, who lived in a small cabin near the kitchen outbuilding, and a groundskeeper named Rufus Teague, who maintained a room above the carriage house. The household had a reputation for being quiet, perhaps too quiet, according to those who occasionally passed by on the river road. Cordelia's first weeks at the Whitmore place were uneventful by most standards. She rose each morning at 5:30 to prepare the morning fires and ensure that hot water was available for the family's ablutions. Her duties included maintaining the upstairs chambers, overseeing the cleaning of the main floor, managing the household linens, and serving as intermediary between Mrs. Whitmore and the cook regarding daily menus. These were standard responsibilities for a head maid in a household of that size and era, and Cordelia performed them with the efficiency that had earned her such favorable recommendations. Yet even in those early weeks, she noticed certain peculiarities that struck her as unusual. The first of these was the matter of the 3rd floor. The Whitmore house possessed an attic level, accessible by a narrow staircase located at the end of the 2nd floor hallway. Just a quick reminder, you are listening to this story on the channel The Fear Behind You. If you are hearing this from any other channel, please be aware that this video has been copied and reposted without my authorization. In that case, I kindly ask you to report it. Thank you for supporting original content. This staircase was locked, and Mrs. Whitmore made clear during Cordelia's initial tour of the house that the 3rd floor was not to be accessed under any circumstances. This was not inherently strange, as many houses of that era had unused upper floors that were closed off to reduce heating costs and maintenance. What Cordelia found peculiar was the lock itself. It was not a simple mechanism, but rather a heavy iron affair more befitting a jail cell than an attic door. And twice during her first week, she could have sworn she heard movement above her room, which was situated directly beneath the locked staircase. The second peculiarity involved the family's evening habits. Dinner at the Whitmore house was served at precisely 7 o'clock, after which the family retired to the parlor for approximately 1 hour. By 9 o'clock, Mr. Whitmore would announce his intention to take his constitutional, which consisted of a solitary walk around the property's perimeter. Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Marchmont would then retire to their respective chambers. This routine was followed with such rigid precision that Cordelia quickly learned to structure her evening duties around it. But on 3 separate occasions during her first month of employment, she observed that Mr. Whitmore did not actually leave the house during his constitutional. She would see him depart through the front door, but later, while extinguishing lamps on the first floor, she would hear his footsteps in the hallway above. When she mentioned this to Bessie Haywood, the cook simply shook her head and said that she did not discuss the family's business, a response that Cordelia found more troubling than reassuring. The third and most disturbing peculiarity was Miss Lavinia Marchmont herself. The woman rarely spoke, and when she did, her words emerged in a whisper so faint that Cordelia often had to ask her to repeat herself. Miss Marchmont spent most of her days in a small sitting room on the second floor, engaged in needlework that never seemed to progress. Her eyes held a quality that Cordelia had difficulty naming, a kind of emptiness that suggested the woman was not entirely present in her surroundings. When Cordelia brought her afternoon tea, Miss Marchmont would sometimes grip her wrist with surprising strength and hold it for several seconds before releasing it without explanation. Mrs. Whitmore dismissed this behavior as nervousness and instructed Cordelia to pay it no mind. It was in late October that events began to take a more troubling turn. Cordelia had been in the employ of the Whitmore household for approximately 5 weeks when she first became aware of the footsteps. They began on a Wednesday evening shortly after 11 o'clock. She had retired to her room, which was located on the second floor at the far end of the servants' corridor, and was preparing for sleep when she heard what sounded like someone walking slowly down the hallway outside her door. The footsteps were measured and deliberate, pausing every few seconds as though the person making them was listening at each door they passed. Cordelia lay perfectly still, her heart racing, as the footsteps approached her room, paused outside her door for what felt like an eternity, and then retreated in the direction from which they had come. The following morning she asked Bessie if anyone had been walking about the house during the night. Bessie's reaction was unexpected. The cook's face went pale, and she gripped the edge of the kitchen table as though to steady herself. After a long moment, she said only that Cordelia should keep her door locked after dark and ask no further questions. When Cordelia pressed for an explanation, Bessie turned away and refused to speak for the remainder of the day. The footsteps returned the following Wednesday at approximately the same hour, and again the Wednesday after that, always at night, always with that same measured, listening quality. Cordelia began to dread Wednesdays with an intensity that interfered with her sleep and her appetite. She considered leaving the position, but economic necessity and a stubborn streak in her character prevented her from simply abandoning her post without understanding what was happening in that house. In mid-November, Cordelia made a decision that would ultimately determine the course of subsequent events. She resolved to stay awake through the night and determine the source of the footsteps. She positioned herself in a chair near her door, which she left slightly ajar, and waited. The house settled into its usual evening stillness. She heard Mrs. Whitmore's door close at 9:15, followed by Miss Marchmont's shortly thereafter. Mr. Whitmore's footsteps descended the main staircase at 9:30 for his constitutional. All was as expected. At 11:12, by her pocket watch, she heard a door open somewhere down the hallway. The footsteps began, but this time Cordelia was watching through the crack in her door. What she saw in the dim light of the hallway's single oil lamp was Mr. Phineas Whitmore, still dressed in his evening clothes, walking slowly from room to room on the second floor. He carried no light of his own, but seemed to move with perfect familiarity in the near darkness. He stopped outside each door, pressed his ear against the wood, and listened for several seconds before moving on. When he reached Cordelia's door, she held her breath and remained absolutely motionless. Through the crack, she could see his eye pressed against the gap, scanning the darkness of her room. After what seemed like several minutes, but was likely only 30 seconds, he moved on. Cordelia did not sleep that night. In the morning she observed Mr. Whitmore at breakfast and found nothing unusual in his demeanor. He ate his eggs and toast, read portions of the Savannah Morning News aloud to his wife, and remarked on the pleasant weather, as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. When his gaze met Cordelia's, she detected no recognition of what had passed between them in the hallway, no acknowledgment that he was aware she had been watching him. This unsettled her more than the nocturnal patrol itself. Over the following weeks, Cordelia began to pay closer attention to the dynamics within the Whitmore household. What she observed raised questions that she found increasingly difficult to ignore. Mrs. Opaline Whitmore, for instance, demonstrated a curious deference to her husband that went beyond the typical submission expected of wives in that era. She never spoke unless spoken to, never expressed an opinion that contradicted his, and flinched almost imperceptibly whenever he entered a room unexpectedly. This behavior was subtle enough that a casual observer might not notice it, but Cordelia had spent enough years in domestic service to recognize the signs of a household operating under the influence of fear. Miss Marchmont's situation was even more concerning. Cordelia had assumed that the woman's strange behavior was the result of natural nervousness or perhaps some form of mental fragility. But as she spent more time in the household, she began to notice patterns that suggested something more deliberate. Miss Marchmont was never left alone. When Mrs. Whitmore was occupied elsewhere in the house, Mr. Whitmore would invariably appear in the sitting room where his sister-in-law spent her days. When both Whitmores had appointments in town, Cordelia was instructed to remain within sight of Miss Marchmont at all times. It was as though the woman was under a form of house arrest, though no one spoke of it in such terms. In early December, an incident occurred that shattered any remaining illusion of normalcy in that house. Cordelia was changing the linens in Miss Marchmont's bedroom when she noticed something wedged between the mattress and the bed frame. It was a small leather-bound notebook, approximately the size of a prayer book. Cordelia knew she should not open it, that such an action represented a serious breach of servant-employer boundaries. But something in Miss Marchmont's haunted eyes had been calling to her for weeks, and she could not resist the compulsion to understand. The notebook contained entries dating back 7 years. They were written in a cramped, hurried hand, as though composed in moments of stolen privacy. The content of these entries was deeply troubling. Miss Marchmont wrote of being brought to the Whitmore house under the pretense of convalescing from an illness. She wrote of discovering that her sister Opaline was not the happily married woman she had portrayed in her letters, but rather someone who had been slowly reduced to a state of complete psychological submission. She wrote of attempting to leave, only to be told by Mr. Whitmore that he had written to their family in Virginia, informing them that Lavinia had suffered a mental collapse and would be remaining under his care indefinitely. She wrote of the locked third floor and what she believed was kept there. And she wrote repeatedly of the Wednesday nights when Mr. Whitmore would walk the hallways checking that everyone was in their place. Everyone was where they should be. Everyone was still under his control. Cordelia replaced the notebook exactly as she had found it. Her hands were trembling. She understood now that she had taken employment in a household that operated according to rules very different from those she had previously known. The question of what to do with this knowledge weighed heavily upon her. That evening, she made an attempt to speak privately with Miss Marchmont. She found her alone briefly in the second-floor sitting room, while Mrs. Whitmore was consulting with Bessie about the week's menus. Cordelia closed the door behind her, and spoke in a low voice, asking Miss Marchmont directly if she needed assistance. The woman's reaction was immediate and frightening. She gripped Cordelia's hand with desperate strength and whispered that Cordelia should leave this house tonight, that there was no helping the women trapped within these walls, and that anyone who tried to interfere would simply become another prisoner. Before Cordelia could respond, they heard Mrs. Whitmore's footsteps approaching in the hallway. Miss Marchmont released her hand and composed her features into their usual blankness with a speed that spoke of long practice. Cordelia did not leave that night. Perhaps this was foolish, but she had never been one to abandon those who needed help, and despite Miss Marchmont's warning, she felt compelled to understand the full scope of what was occurring in that house before making any decisions about what to do. This compulsion would prove to be both her greatest vulnerability and, ultimately, her salvation. The Wednesday patrols continued through December. Cordelia no longer pretended to sleep through them, but instead listened from her locked door, tracking Mr. Whitmore's progress through the house. She noticed that his route was not random. He always began with the servants' rooms, then proceeded to the family chambers, then climbed the narrow staircase to the locked third floor. She could hear his footsteps on the floor above her room, walking the length of what must have been the attic, pausing at intervals that suggested he was checking something or someone. It was 3 days before Christmas that Cordelia encountered Rufus Teague, the groundskeeper, in circumstances that would change her understanding of the Whitmore household entirely. She had gone to the carriage house to retrieve some old newspapers that Mrs. Whitmore wanted for packing Christmas gifts. Rufus was there, performing maintenance on the carriage, and he startled when Cordelia entered. After a moment of awkward silence, he asked her how she was finding the position. There was something in his tone that suggested the question carried more weight than its words implied. Cordelia answered carefully, saying only that the work was demanding, but within her capabilities. Rufus nodded slowly, then said something that Cordelia would remember for the rest of her life. He said that the last 3 women who had held her position had all left within 6 months. 2 had departed in the night without giving notice, and 1 had been found wandering along the river road in a state of profound distress, unable to recall how she had gotten there or what had happened to her in the weeks prior to her departure. The local physician had attributed her condition to nervous exhaustion, but Rufus did not believe that explanation. When Cordelia asked why he stayed if the household was so troubled, Rufus replied that he had his reasons, ones he was not at liberty to discuss. But he urged her to be careful, especially on Wednesday nights, and especially regarding the third floor. He would say nothing more, despite Cordelia's attempts to draw him out. And soon she returned to the main house with her newspapers, her mind churning with questions that had no satisfactory answers. The holiday season passed with a peculiar quiet in the Whitmore house. There was no tree, no decorations, no festive meals beyond a slightly larger than usual dinner on Christmas Day. Mr. Whitmore presided over the household with his typical rigid propriety, and nothing in his demeanor suggested the nocturnal activities that Cordelia now knew he conducted. She watched him carefully, searching for some sign of the person who walked the hallways at night, but found none. It was as though he was 2 different men inhabiting the same body, one who functioned according to the rules of polite society, and another who emerged only in darkness. January brought cold weather and a kind of tension that seemed to permeate the very walls of the house. Miss Marchmont's condition appeared to be worsening. She spoke even less than before and spent long hours staring out the window of her sitting room at the empty grounds beyond. Mrs. Whitmore, too, seemed increasingly agitated, though she took pains to conceal it behind her practiced composure. Only Mr. Whitmore remained unchanged, his movements and habits as regular as clockwork. It was on the second Wednesday of January that Cordelia made her most significant discovery. She had been unable to sleep and was sitting in her chair near the door, as had become her habit, when she heard the now familiar footsteps ascending the stairs to the third floor. But this time, instead of the usual brief visit, Mr. Whitmore remained on the upper floor for nearly 2 hours, and for the first time Cordelia heard a sound coming from above that was not footsteps. It was a voice, high and thin, speaking or perhaps crying in a cadence that she could not quite make out. The voice rose, accompanied occasionally by what might have been Mr. Whitmore's deeper tones. The following morning, Cordelia examined the locked staircase door with new attention. The lock was formidable, but the wood of the door frame showed signs of age and wear. More importantly, she noticed that the key to the lock hung on a hook inside Mr. Whitmore's study, which was accessible during the day when he was occupied elsewhere in the house. A plan began to form in her mind, one that she knew was dangerous, but that she felt increasingly compelled to execute. She waited 2 weeks before acting, using the time to study the household's routines with even greater care. She learned that Mr. Whitmore took his afternoon tea in the parlor every day at 3 o'clock and typically remained there for approximately 45 minutes. This gave her a window of opportunity, though a narrow one. On the last Wednesday of January, she put her plan into motion. At 10 minutes past 3, Cordelia entered Mr. Whitmore's study and retrieved the key from its hook. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she feared it might be audible throughout the house. She climbed the main staircase to the second floor, then proceeded to the narrow servant staircase that led to the locked door. Her hands were shaking as she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The mechanism was stiff, but yielded with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness of the house. The stairs beyond the door were steep and narrow, constructed of rough-hewn wood that creaked beneath her weight. She ascended slowly, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimness. At the top she found herself in a long corridor with doors on either side, similar in layout to the family bedrooms below. Most of the doors were open, revealing empty rooms filled with dust and forgotten furniture. But at the far end of the corridor, one door was closed, and from beneath it, Cordelia could see a faint line of light. She approached the closed door and pressed her ear against it. Silence. She tried the handle and found it unlocked. When she opened the door, what she saw within would haunt her for the rest of her days. The room had been converted into a kind of chamber, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single chair. The walls were covered in writing, cramped lines of text that spiraled across the plaster in a dizzying pattern. Some of it appeared to be scripture, some appeared to be lists of names, and some was simply the same word repeated hundreds of times. Waiting. Sitting on the bed, looking at Cordelia with eyes that showed no surprise, was a woman of perhaps 50 years. Her hair was gray and unkempt. Her clothing was plain but clean, and her face bore an expression of such profound resignation that Cordelia felt tears spring to her eyes unbidden. The woman spoke first. She said that Cordelia must be the new one, and asked if she had come to bring her food or to ask questions. Cordelia replied that she had come to understand. The woman nodded slowly, as though this answer was both expected and inadequate. What followed was a conversation that lasted less than 15 minutes, but contained revelations that Cordelia would spend years trying to process. The woman on the bed was Phineas Whitmore's first wife, Eugenia, who the world believed had perished in a fever epidemic in 1897. She had not perished. She had simply been moved to the third floor after her husband decided that she was no longer suitable for public presentation. Her crime, as she described it, was questioning his authority in front of a dinner guests. Her punishment was a life of complete isolation, visible only to her husband during his nightly visits, during which he would sit in the chair and lecture her on the virtues of obedience. Eugenia explained that Opaline was the second wife, married to Phineas only 2 years after Eugenia's supposed passing. She had learned of Eugenia's existence early in the marriage, but had been persuaded to remain silent through a combination of threats and promises. Miss Marchmont had discovered the truth during a visit, and had been kept in the house ever since, another prisoner hidden in plain sight. The servants who had worked here over the years had either remained ignorant of the third floor's secret, or had been dealt with in ways that Eugenia could only speculate about. Cordelia asked why Eugenia had not tried to escape, to make herself known when visitors came to the house, to signal someone passing on the river road. Eugenia's answer was simple and devastating. She said that she had tried all of those things in the early years. The windows of the third floor had been sealed and painted black from the outside. Her voice had grown weak from disuse and could not carry far enough to be heard from the ground. And Mr. Whitmore had made clear that if she attempted to contact the outside world, he would ensure that she never had another opportunity to try again. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house. Mr. Whitmore had finished his tea. Cordelia had perhaps 2 minutes before he would wonder where she was. She gripped Eugenia's hand and promised that she would return, that she would find a way to help. Eugenia shook her head sadly and said that she had heard such promises before, but she did not withdraw her hand. Cordelia descended the stairs as quickly as she dared, locked the door behind her, and returned the key to its hook in the study just moments before Mr. Whitmore appeared in the hallway. He looked at her with what might have been suspicion, then asked if everything was in order. Cordelia replied that it was, sir, perfectly in order. He nodded and proceeded toward his study. Cordelia retreated to her duties, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult of Cordelia's life. She knew that she possessed information that could expose Mr. Whitmore's actions and potentially free the women trapped in his household. But she also knew that making such accusations against a man of his standing, without concrete evidence that others could verify, would likely result in her being dismissed as hysterical or vindictive. She needed proof, and she needed allies. She began with Bessie Haywood. The cook had worked for the Whitmores for over a decade and clearly knew more than she had been willing to reveal. Cordelia approached her one evening after dinner, when they were alone in the kitchen, and told her directly what she had discovered on the third floor. Bessie's reaction confirmed Cordelia's suspicions. The cook wept openly and confessed that she had known about Eugenia for years, but had been too afraid to speak or act. Mr. Whitmore had told her that if she breathed a word to anyone, he would see to it that she was charged with theft and sent to prison. She had a son in Savannah who depended on her income, and she could not risk losing her freedom and her ability to support him. Cordelia did not judge Bessie for her silence. She understood the impossible position that the cook had been placed in, the way that fear and economic necessity could trap a person as surely as any locked door. Instead, she asked if Bessie would be willing to provide testimony if Cordelia could find a way to bring the truth to light safely. After a long moment, Bessie agreed. Rufus Teague proved to be another unexpected ally. When Cordelia approached him with what she had learned, he revealed that he had suspected the truth for years. His grandfather had been a servant in the house during Eugenia's early years of marriage, and family stories had suggested that all was not as it appeared with the Whitmores. Rufus had taken the groundskeeper position in part to learn more about what had happened to Eugenia, and in part because he felt a sense of responsibility to the family history that had been suppressed for so long. He, too, agreed to provide testimony if a safe opportunity arose. The question of how to proceed remained vexing. The local sheriff was known to be a friend of Mr. Whitmore's, having received financial support from him during his last election campaign. The county judge was similarly compromised. Cordelia needed to find an authority outside of Bryan County's social networks, someone who would take her claims seriously and have the power to investigate them thoroughly. It was Miss Marchmont who provided the solution, though not in any way that Cordelia could have anticipated. In early February, Miss Marchmont managed to pass Cordelia a folded piece of paper during a moment when they were briefly alone. On it was written the name and address of a journalist in Savannah who had once published articles critical of the treatment of women in Georgia's mental institutions. Miss Marchmont had remembered the name from newspapers she had read before her confinement, and believed that this man might be sympathetic to their situation. Cordelia wrote to the journalist, a man named Aldous Fenimore, providing a detailed account of everything she had discovered and requesting a meeting at his earliest convenience. She sent the letter through the post office in Way's Station, walking the 7 miles rather than using the Whitmore carriage, to ensure that no one in the household would be aware of the correspondence. Then she waited. The response came 3 weeks later, delivered to Cordelia at the Way Station post office, where she had arranged to receive it. Fenimore expressed both concern and skepticism. He had encountered false accusations before and needed to verify her claims before taking any action. He proposed a meeting in Savannah on a specific date in early March, during which he would assess her credibility and discuss potential next steps. Cordelia agreed. The challenge of getting to Savannah without arousing suspicion required careful planning. Cordelia requested a half-day off to visit a sick cousin in the area, a lie that she delivered with convincing concern. Mrs. Whitmore granted the request without apparent suspicion, though Cordelia noticed Mr. Whitmore watching her with unusual attention as she departed the house. The meeting with Fenimore took place in a modest office above a print shop on Broughton Street. The journalist was a man of perhaps 45, with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested both intelligence and caution. He listened to Cordelia's account without interruption, asked several pointed questions about specific details, and then sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he had heard. When he spoke, his words were measured. He said that if her claims were true, this was one of the most disturbing cases of domestic imprisonment he had ever encountered. But he also said that proving such claims would be extraordinarily difficult. A man of Whitmore's standing could easily dismiss the testimony of servants, and without physical evidence or the cooperation of the imprisoned women themselves, any accusation would likely be dismissed as slander. He asked if there was any way to obtain such evidence or cooperation. Cordelia proposed a plan that had been forming in her mind for weeks. She would find a way to get Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Marchmont out of the house while Fenimore and any witnesses he could gather searched the 3rd floor and encountered Eugenia directly. The logistics were complex and the risks were significant, but Cordelia believed it could work if executed carefully. Fenimore agreed to the plan with modifications. He would bring 2 witnesses, both men of standing whose testimony would be difficult to dismiss. They would approach the house under the guise of being potential buyers for a piece of land that bordered the Whitmore property. This would require Mr. Whitmore to be present to discuss the sale, leaving the house temporarily unguarded. Cordelia would ensure that the 3rd floor door was unlocked and that the visitors had an opportunity to witness Eugenia's presence. From there, the scandal would be impossible to suppress. The date was set for the 3rd Wednesday of March. Cordelia returned to the Whitmore house and resumed her duties as though nothing had changed. She continued her careful observations of the household routines, noting any changes that might affect the plan. She also made several more visits to the 3rd floor, bringing Eugenia food and updates on the developing situation. The imprisoned woman listened with a mixture of hope and fear, warning Cordelia repeatedly that her husband was more dangerous than she realized. As the date approached, Cordelia noticed that Mr. Whitmore's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. His nightly patrols lasted longer, and he began checking the servants' rooms during the day as well, appearing suddenly in doorways as though hoping to catch someone in an act of disobedience. Mrs. Whitmore seemed more nervous than usual, dropping items and starting at sudden sounds. Even Bessie, who had maintained her composure throughout the preceding months, showed signs of strain. On the morning of the appointed Wednesday, Fenimore's message arrived confirming that he and his witnesses would arrive at the house at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Cordelia relayed the information to Bessie and Rufus, both of whom would play minor but important roles in the plan. Then she waited. At 1:30, a messenger arrived at the Whitmore house with a letter purportedly from a business associate in Savannah, urgently requesting a meeting about the land sale that afternoon. Mr. Whitmore read the letter, frowned, and announced to his wife that he would be meeting with some gentlemen regarding the property boundary matter. He departed in the carriage at 1:45. Cordelia had approximately 1 hour before Mr. Whitmore would return and discover that the visitors were not at the location specified in the letter. During that hour, she needed to get Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Marchmont away from the house, unlock the 3rd floor, and ensure that Fenimore's party had access to Eugenia. The first part of the plan involved a minor crisis. Cordelia informed Mrs. Whitmore that she had discovered signs of a leak in the cellar that threatened the stored preserves. This required Mrs. Whitmore's attention, as such household matters fell under her domain. While Mrs. Whitmore was occupied in the cellar, Cordelia helped Miss Marchmont to the carriage house, where Rufus was waiting with a buggy that would take her to the Ways Station telegraph office, ostensibly to send a message to family in Virginia. In reality, it would take her to the home of a local minister who had agreed to provide temporary sanctuary. With Miss Marchmont safely departed and Mrs. Whitmore occupied in the cellar, Cordelia retrieved the key and unlocked the 3rd floor door. She had just returned to the 2nd floor when Fenimore and his 2 companions arrived at the front entrance. They were exactly on time. Cordelia greeted them as though they were expected guests and led them directly to the 3rd floor staircase. She watched their faces as they climbed the stairs and entered the corridor above. She watched them open the door to Eugenia's chamber. She watched the horror and outrage transform their features as they comprehended what they were seeing. And she watched Eugenia, for the first time in 15 years, speak to someone other than her husband, her voice breaking as she told strangers her name and her story. The aftermath unfolded over several weeks and involved complications that Cordelia had not anticipated. Mr. Whitmore returned to find his house occupied by outsiders and his secret exposed. His initial response was denial, then threats, then an attempt to claim that Eugenia was mentally unfit and that her imprisonment had been a form of compassionate care. These claims were undermined by Fenimore's published account, which appeared in the Savannah Evening Journal and was subsequently reprinted in papers across Georgia and beyond. The legal proceedings that followed were lengthy and contentious. Mr. Whitmore retained prominent attorneys who argued that a husband had the right to manage his wife's care as he saw fit, particularly if she was mentally unwell. The prosecution countered with testimony from physicians who examined Eugenia and found her to be in full possession of her faculties, her only affliction being the profound psychological effects of prolonged isolation. Mrs. Whitmore and Miss Marchmont both provided testimony about the conditions in the household, their words carrying additional weight because of their family relationships to the accused. In the end, Mr. Phineas Whitmore was convicted of unlawful imprisonment and sentenced to 8 years in the state penitentiary. Eugenia Whitmore, having reclaimed her legal identity and her freedom, filed for divorce on grounds that were granted without opposition. Mrs. Opaline Whitmore returned to her family in Virginia, accompanied by her sister Lavinia, who gradually recovered some of the vitality that had been drained from her during her years of confinement. The Whitmore house itself sat empty for several years before being purchased by a family from Atlanta who knew nothing of its history. Cordelia Vickers continued in domestic service for another 12 years before retiring to a small cottage near Savannah. According to records I located during my research, she never married again, but maintained close friendships with a number of women she had met during her years working in various households. She passed in 1954 at the age of 76 having lived long enough to see significant changes in both the legal protections available to women and the social attitudes toward domestic service. The documents I consulted while reconstructing this account came from several sources. The Bryan County court records, which contained transcripts of the trial proceedings, the Savannah Evening Journal archives, which held Fenimore's original articles, a collection of letters written by Eugenia Whitmore to her sister during her final years, which were donated to the Georgia Historical Society in 1962, and a memoir written by Lavinia Marchmont in 1935, which was never published but survived in manuscript form in the possession of her descendants. What strikes me most about this case, even now, is how effectively it was concealed for so long. The Whitmore household operated according to rules of propriety and routine that appeared entirely normal from the outside. Visitors came and went without suspecting anything unusual. Servants worked in the house for years without discovering the truth about the third floor. The local community accepted the Whitmores as respectable members of society without questioning the peculiarities that might have revealed what was hidden within their walls. I think often about the footsteps that Cordelia heard on those Wednesday nights, the sound of someone walking slowly through the darkness, checking doors, ensuring that everyone was in their place. It was a ritual of control, a reminder that someone was always watching, always listening, always maintaining the order that kept his secrets safe. But it was also, ultimately, the thing that alerted Cordelia to the wrongness of that house. Without those footsteps, she might have remained ignorant of what was occurring above her head. Without her curiosity about those footsteps, Eugenia might have spent the rest of her life in that attic chamber. Sometimes the things that frighten us are also the things that save us. The presence that patrols the hallways at night, checking that all is as it should be, can also be the presence that reveals what should never have been hidden in the first place. In 1961, a researcher from the University of Georgia attempted to locate the Whitmore house for a study of antebellum architecture in coastal Georgia. He found only a foundation and a chimney, the house itself having burned under unexplained circumstances sometime in the 1940s. The land has since returned to forest, the pines growing thick where the veranda once stood. Nothing remains to indicate what occurred there, except the documents in various archives and the memories passed down through families who once worked on that property. If you have made it this far in this account, I thank you for your attention. These stories deserve to be remembered, not because they are entertaining, though I hope they have held your interest, but because they remind us of what can happen when power is concentrated in the hands of those who answer to no one, when the structures of a household become prisons for those who live within them, and when the silence of servants and neighbors allows cruelty to flourish unchecked. There are no ghosts in this story, no supernatural forces at work, only people, making choices that shape the lives of others in ways both visible and hidden. The footsteps in the night were not spectral visitations, but the patrols of a man who believed that he had the right to control everything and everyone within his domain. The terror was not imaginary, but entirely, devastatingly real. I wonder sometimes if Cordelia ever regretted her decision to investigate, rather than simply leave that house and put its strangeness behind her. Based on the evidence I have found, I believe she did not. She seems to have viewed her actions as a natural extension of her character, a refusal to look away from injustice, even when looking away would have been easier and safer. She was not a heroic figure in the traditional sense, not someone of wealth or status or public influence. She was a domestic servant, a woman whose daily work was maintaining the appearances of other people's households. But she understood, perhaps better than most, that appearances could conceal terrible realities, and that sometimes the only way to address those realities was to look directly at them, no matter the cost. The house on the Ogeechee River is gone now. The people who lived and worked there have passed. But the questions they faced remain relevant. How do we recognize the prisons that are built within the structures of everyday life? How do we find the courage to challenge those who have power over us? And how do we ensure that the suffering hidden behind closed doors does not go unwitnessed and unaddressed? I do not have easy answers to these questions, but I believe that telling stories like this one is part of the process of finding them. When we remember what has happened in the past, we equip ourselves to recognize similar patterns in the present. When we honor those who acted against injustice, we encourage others to do the same. And when we acknowledge the reality of suffering that was once concealed, we assert that such concealment is wrong, and that truth, however painful, is better than comfortable ignorance. This case was eventually archived by Bryan County authorities in 1913 and remained largely forgotten until a local historian stumbled upon references to it while researching the region's agricultural history in 1958. The documents were briefly examined, cataloged, and returned to storage, where they remained until my own research brought them to light once more. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, some secrets are meant to be revealed, and some footsteps in the night are meant to be followed, even when following them leads to places we would rather not go. The maid heard footsteps at night. She could have ignored them. She could have convinced herself that they were nothing unusual, just the sounds of an old house settling or a restless employer unable to sleep. Instead, she listened, she watched, she investigated. And because she did, 3 women found their way back to freedom. That is the power of attention, of refusing to accept the explanations offered by those who benefit from our ignorance. That is the courage of ordinary people who choose to see what is hidden in plain sight. The Whitmore case is not the only one of its kind. During my years of research, I have encountered numerous accounts of similar situations, households, where the domestic arrangements concealed darker realities, where servants and neighbors knew more than they were willing to say, where the boundaries between care and control became blurred beyond recognition. These cases rarely made headlines. They rarely resulted in trials or convictions. They simply existed, part of the texture of ordinary life, visible to those who looked, but invisible to those who did not wish to see. I believe that Cordelia Vickers would want us to look. She spent 15 months in the Whitmore household, risking her livelihood and potentially her safety, because she could not turn away from what she had discovered. Her example suggests that seeing injustice carries with it a responsibility to act, however that action might be shaped by the circumstances we face. The footsteps still echo, in a sense. They echo in every household where power is wielded without accountability. They echo in every silence that protects those who cause harm. They echo in every choice we make about whether to look more closely or to accept the surface of things as the whole truth. Listen for them. And when you hear them, ask yourself what they might mean. The documents regarding this case were last accessed in the Bryan County archives in 1967. My attempts to locate them again in preparation for this account were unsuccessful, as a fire in the records building in 1971 destroyed much of the material from that period. What remains exists only in copies made by researchers in the intervening years and in the newspaper accounts that were preserved in separate archives. The original trial transcripts, the letters, the photographs taken of the third-floor chamber, all of these are gone, but the story persists. Passed from researcher to researcher, mentioned in footnotes and appendices, remembered by the descendants of those who were involved. It persists because it matters, because it speaks to something fundamental about the human condition and the capacity for both cruelty and courage that exists within us all. Cordelia Vickers heard footsteps at night. She realized they were waiting for her, and she chose to face them rather than hide. May we all find such courage when it is asked of us. There is one final element of this account that I have hesitated to include, not because it is unverified, but because it adds a dimension of unease that I find difficult to articulate. In 1923, nearly a decade after the trial that exposed the Whitmore household secrets, a woman named Hattie Crenshaw came forward with a claim that she had worked as a maid in that house in 1908, 4 years before Cordelia's arrival. Her account, published in a small local newspaper that has since ceased publication, described experiences remarkably similar to those Cordelia would later report: the Wednesday night patrols, the locked third floor, the palpable atmosphere of fear that pervaded the household. Hattie claimed that she too had heard the footsteps. She too had noticed the peculiar dynamics between Mr. Whitmore and the women under his roof. But unlike Cordelia, Hattie had chosen to leave without investigating further. She had been young, only 22 at the time, and the pay was too meager to justify the constant sense of dread that settled over her each evening as darkness fell. She gave her notice after 6 weeks and never looked back. What haunted Hattie, according to her account, was not what she had experienced, but what she had failed to do. She had sensed that something was wrong in that house. She had heard things that should have prompted questions, and she had walked away, telling herself that it was not her place to pry into the affairs of her employers, that whatever occurred in the Whitmore household was not her concern. When she read about the trial in 1913, when she learned what had been happening on that third floor all those years, the weight of what she had chosen not to see nearly crushed her. Hattie's account raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of complicity and the boundaries of moral responsibility. She did nothing wrong in the legal sense. She worked her position honestly and departed in an appropriate manner. She had no obligation to investigate the household's secrets or to risk her own well-being for the sake of strangers. And yet she carried the burden of her inaction for the rest of her life, wondering if Eugenia's years of imprisonment might have been shortened had she found the courage to look more closely. I mention Hattie because her experience illuminates something important about the nature of the harm that occurred in that house. It was not a sudden catastrophe, not an event that could be traced to a single decision or moment. It was an ongoing condition, sustained day after day, year after year, by the silence and inattention of everyone who passed through its doors. Each servant who noticed something strange and chose not to investigate. Each visitor who sensed an odd atmosphere but asked no questions. Each neighbor who wondered about the household's isolation but kept their wonderings to themselves. All of these contributed, in their way, to the continuation of what should never have been allowed to continue. This is not to blame those who did not act. The pressures they faced were real, the risks of speaking out substantial. But it is to acknowledge that the suffering hidden within the Whitmore house was not solely the creation of Phineas Whitmore. It was also enabled by a social structure that discouraged curiosity, that valued propriety over truth, that made it easier to look away than to look closely at what might be uncomfortable to see. Cordelia Vickers was unusual, not because she possessed extraordinary moral clarity or uncommon bravery. She was unusual because she allowed herself to be troubled by what she observed, because she refused to accept the convenient explanations that would have allowed her to continue her work without further thought. She was, in a sense, simply paying attention in a world that encouraged people not to. The question this raises, for me at least, is what we miss when we fail to pay attention. What secrets persist in the households and institutions around us because no one has looked closely enough to discover them? What suffering continues because those who might notice have trained themselves not to see? I do not ask these questions to induce guilt or to suggest that we are all responsible for evils we know nothing about. I ask them because I believe that the capacity for attention is something that can be cultivated, that the choice to look more closely at what seems normal is one we can make deliberately. Cordelia was not born with a special gift for perceiving hidden truths. She developed that capacity through years of careful observation in her work as a domestic servant, learning to read the subtle signs of household dynamics that others might overlook. And when those skills revealed something terrible, she chose to act on what she had learned rather than pretend she had not learned it. The Whitmore case ended with a measure of justice, though an imperfect one. 8 years in prison for 15 years of unlawful imprisonment hardly seems proportionate. Eugenia regained her freedom but never fully recovered from what had been done to her. The household dissolved, its members scattered to different fates, some finding peace and others carrying wounds that never healed. The house itself eventually burned, as though the land itself wished to be rid of what had occurred there. But the story persisted. Through newspaper accounts and court records, and the memories of those who were involved, it persisted. And through that persistence, it continued to teach, to remind, to warn. I have spent considerable time researching the region where these events occurred. The Ogeechee River still flows through Bryan County, its waters carrying the sediment of centuries toward the Atlantic. The longleaf pine forests still stand in some areas, though much of the land has been developed or converted to other uses. Way Station became Richmond Hill in 1941, transformed by the investments of the Ford family into something very different from the rural crossroads it had been in Cordelia's time. The isolation that once characterized the area has given way to highways and suburbs and the steady encroachment of Savannah's expanding reach. Yet, even now, there are places along the river where you can sense something of what the region must have been like in 1912. Quiet stretches of water bordered by marsh grass and cypress trees. Dirt roads that wind through forests so dense that the sunlight barely penetrates. Houses set back from the road, barely visible through the vegetation, their occupants invisible to passers-by. In these places, it is easy to imagine how a household like the Whitmores might have existed for decades without anyone outside its walls fully understanding what was happening within. The history of domestic service in the American South during this period is one of profound inequality and often exploitation. The vast majority of domestic workers were black women, for whom service in white households was frequently the only employment option available. They worked long hours for minimal pay, often living in their employers' homes and thus subject to constant oversight and control. The power imbalance between servant and employer was enormous, and the opportunities for abuse were correspondingly vast. Cordelia Vickers was notable in this context, and her position afforded her certain protections and opportunities that would not have been available to all servants in similar households. She could leave more easily if conditions became intolerable. She could speak to authorities with a greater expectation of being heard. She could pursue justice through channels that were not always equally accessible to all workers. This does not diminish her courage or her moral clarity, but it does contextualize it, reminding us that the ability to act against injustice is not equally distributed, and that the structures of power that enabled the Whitmore household's secrets also shaped who was in a position to expose them. I think often about the other servants who passed through that house before Cordelia arrived, the women who left in the night without giving notice, the woman found wandering the river road in a state of distress. What did they experience? What did they see or hear that drove them away? Did any of them suspect the truth about the third floor, and if so, why did they not speak? We cannot know for certain. Their stories are not recorded in the archives I have consulted, their voices lost to history, but their presence in Rufus Teague's account suggests that the pattern of troubling events in the Whitmore household was not unique to Cordelia's tenure. Others before her had sensed that something was wrong, others had been frightened enough to flee, and yet none of them, as far as we know, took the steps that Cordelia would eventually take. Perhaps they lacked the resources or connections that Cordelia possessed. Perhaps they faced pressures or constraints that made action impossible. Perhaps they simply did not see what Cordelia saw, their attention directed elsewhere by the demands of their daily work, We cannot judge them, knowing so little of their circumstances. But we can acknowledge that the path from recognition to action is not always straightforward, that many factors can intervene between seeing injustice and doing something about it. The journalist Aldous Fenimore continued his work investigating conditions in Georgia's institutions after the Whitmore case. His articles on mental asylums led to reforms in how patients were treated and how facilities were inspected. He became an advocate for those who lacked the power to advocate for themselves, using his pen and his platform to shine light into dark corners that might otherwise have remained hidden. He credited the Whitmore case as a turning point in his career, the moment when he understood most clearly the importance of the work he was doing. Fenimore passed in 1938, his obituary noting his contributions to investigative journalism and his tireless advocacy for the vulnerable. Among his papers, preserved by his family, was a photograph of Cordelia Vickers taken sometime in the 1920s. She is standing in front of a modest house, her expression serious, but not unkind. On the back of the photograph, in Fenimore's handwriting, are the words, "The bravest woman I have ever known." Such assessments are subjective, of course. Bravery manifests in many forms, and there is no objective measure by which to rank acts of courage. But Fenimore's sentiment captures something real about what Cordelia did and why it mattered. In a situation where looking away would have been easier, where silence would have been safer, where the pressures of propriety and position counseled against interference, she chose to look and to act. That choice, however we characterize it, made a difference in the lives of people who had no other hope of escape. The footsteps that Cordelia heard on those Wednesday nights were waiting for her, in a sense. They were waiting for someone who would not simply hear them and dismiss them, who would not simply endure them and move on. They were waiting for someone who would follow them, question them, discover what they meant. Cordelia was that person. And because she was, the footsteps finally fell silent, the patrol finally ended, the watcher finally became the watched. There is something almost poetic in that reversal, though I am wary of finding poetry in situations of genuine suffering. The Whitmore household was not a metaphor or a symbol. It was a real place where real people experienced real harm. The women confined within its walls did not suffer for our edification or to teach us lessons about the human condition. They suffered because they had the misfortune to be in the power of someone who chose to use that power cruelly. And yet stories like this one do teach, whether we intend them to or not. They teach us about the capacity for both cruelty and courage that exists within ordinary people. They teach us about the structures that enable harm and the actions that can dismantle them. They teach us, perhaps most importantly, about the power of attention, about what becomes possible when someone chooses to look closely at what others have chosen to overlook. I began this account by noting that in the autumn of 1912, along the banks of the Ogeechee River in Bryan County, Georgia, there existed a house that the locals referred to only as the Whitmore place. That house is gone now, its location unmarked, its history known only to those who have taken the trouble to research it. But the questions it raises remain as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. How do we recognize the prisons built within the structures of everyday life? How do we find the courage to act when action is dangerous? And how do we ensure that suffering does not continue unwitnessed in the places we cannot or will not see? The maid heard footsteps at night until she realized they were waiting for her, and she answered. In the years since I first encountered records of this case, I have often wondered what became of the Whitmore property itself. The land, after all, does not simply vanish because the people who owned it are gone. Someone must have inherited it, purchased it, or allowed it to return to the state. Tracing this history proved more difficult than I had anticipated. Following Phineas Whitmore's conviction, the property passed to his estranged wife Eugenia, who by all accounts wanted nothing more than to be rid of it. She sold the land and house in 1914 to a timber company based in Savannah, which harvested the remaining longleaf pines and then abandoned the property to taxes. For nearly 15 years, the house stood empty, visited only by occasional travelers seeking shelter from storms and by local residents who had heard rumors of what had occurred there. In 1929, a family from Augusta purchased the property at a tax sale, intending to restore it as a country retreat. They arrived that summer with plans and optimism, but according to accounts I found in a local historical society's files, they departed within 3 months. The family patriarch, a businessman named Gideon Sutcliffe, told neighbors that the house was simply too far gone to be worth repairing. The roof leaked, the foundation was shifting, and the cost of restoration would exceed the value of the property. This explanation was accepted without question, though some who knew the property's history wondered if there was more to the Sutcliffes' hasty departure than structural concerns. The house stood empty again until the early 1940s, when it burned under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained. The fire was reported by a passing motorist who noticed smoke rising from the direction of the old Whitmore place. By the time anyone arrived to investigate, the structure was fully engulfed and beyond saving. The county fire marshal ruled the cause as probable lightning strike, though several witnesses noted that there had been no storms in the area that night. The truth of what happened may never be known. What remains of the property today is little more than a clearing in the forest, accessible only by a narrow track that branches off from the main road approximately 3 miles north of what is now Richmond Hill. I visited the site during my research, guided by directions from a local historian who had documented the property's location based on old survey records. The foundation stones are still visible if you know where to look, partially buried under decades of fallen leaves and encroaching vegetation. A single chimney stands at the north end of the former house, its bricks darkened by fire and weather. There is nothing to indicate what occurred here, no marker or plaque, no acknowledgement that this quiet clearing was once the site of such profound suffering. Standing in that clearing, surrounded by the sounds of the forest and the distant murmur of the Ogeechee River, I found myself thinking about all the places like this that exist throughout the world. Places where terrible things happened, where lives were destroyed or diminished, where secrets were kept for years or decades. Most of these places bear no outward sign of their histories. The buildings crumble or are replaced, the people move away or pass on, and eventually only the land remains, indifferent to what has occurred upon it. And yet the stories persist, in archives and memories and the whispered conversations of those who know. They persist because we need them to, because forgetting what has happened in these places makes it easier for similar things to happen again. The Whitmore house is gone, but the dynamics that allowed it to function as a prison are not. Isolation, economic dependence, the deference accorded to those with power, the reluctance to interfere in what are deemed private matters, all of these continue to enable harm in households around the world. I do not tell this story to suggest that nothing has changed since 1912. Many things have changed. Legal protections for workers have expanded. The ability to communicate with the outside world has increased dramatically. The cultural norms that once dictated that servants should be seen and not heard, that private household matters were not appropriate subjects for outside inquiry, have shifted considerably. These changes are real and meaningful. But I also do not tell this story to suggest that the problems it reveals have been solved. They have not. In homes throughout this country, and others, people remain trapped in situations of exploitation and abuse, unable to escape due to economic necessity, fear of retaliation, or simple lack of knowledge about the resources available to them. The forms may differ from what Eugenia Whitmore experienced, but the fundamental dynamics of power and control persist. Cordelia Vickers understood something that I think we would do well to remember. She understood that the appearance of normality is not the same as normality itself. She understood that routine and propriety can mask the most profound violations of human dignity. And she understood that the only way to know what is really happening in a place is to pay attention, to notice what does not quite fit, to follow the footsteps that should not be there. The footsteps she heard on those Wednesday nights were not supernatural. They were the sound of a man conducting his nightly audit, ensuring that his control over his household remained absolute. They were the sound of fear being enforced, of boundaries being maintained, of secrets being kept. And they were ultimately the sound that led Cordelia to discover what was hidden on the third floor. In a sense, those footsteps were a gift. Without them, Cordelia might never have realized that anything was amiss. The Wednesday patrols were so unusual, so clearly outside the bounds of normal household behavior, that they demanded explanation. They were the thread that, once pulled, unraveled the entire fabric of deception that the Whitmores had constructed. I wonder sometimes if Phineas Whitmore understood the risk he was taking by conducting those patrols. Did he believe that his servants were too cowed or too indifferent to notice? Did he think that the strangeness of his behavior would simply be accepted as the eccentricity of an aging man? Or was he so accustomed to his own routines that he no longer saw them as unusual, so immersed in his system of control that he could not imagine anyone questioning it? We cannot know what was in his mind. The trial transcripts contain his defense, which consisted primarily of arguments about his rights as a husband and claims that his wife's imprisonment was medically necessary. There is no record of him explaining why he walked the halls at night, why he checked each door, why he visited the third floor in the small hours. These behaviors were acknowledged but never explained. They were simply part of who he was and how he maintained his household. The psychology of control is a subject that has been studied extensively in the decades since this case occurred. We understand now, in ways that were not well articulated in 1912, how isolation erodes a person's sense of self, how constant surveillance creates a state of perpetual anxiety, how the unpredictability of punishment keeps victims in a state of compliance. We have frameworks for understanding what Phineas Whitmore did and why it was so effective at keeping his prisoners trapped. But understanding these dynamics intellectually is different from recognizing them in practice. The households where such abuse occurs rarely announce themselves. They appear from the outside to be ordinary places inhabited by ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. It is only when someone looks more closely, when someone follows the thread of something that does not quite fit, that the truth becomes visible. Cordelia Vickers looked closely. She followed the thread. And in doing so, she changed the lives of everyone in that household, including her own. The final entry in Lavinia Marchmont's unpublished memoir describes the moment she learned that Cordelia had succeeded in exposing the household's secrets. She was at the minister's house in Ways Station, having been taken there by Rufus Teague as part of the plan to remove her from the property. A neighbor arrived with news that outsiders were at the Whitmore house, that something significant was happening there. Lavinia writes that she felt nothing at first, a kind of numbness that had become her default state after years of helpless captivity. And then, slowly, the realization dawned. It was over. The waiting was over. The fear was over. The silence that had been imposed upon her for so long no longer had power. She wept, she writes, for nearly an hour. Not from joy exactly, though there was joy in it, but from relief, from the release of tension that had been building for years, from the simple, overwhelming fact that someone had finally seen what was happening and had chosen to act. Someone had listened to the footsteps and followed them to their source. Someone had opened the locked door and found what was hidden behind it. Someone had refused to accept the explanations offered and had sought the truth instead. That someone was a domestic servant, A woman whose job was to maintain the surfaces of other people's lives, and yet she saw past those surfaces to what lay beneath. She paid attention when attention was dangerous. She acted when action was risky. And because she did, 3 women found their way back to freedom. This is not a story about heroes and villains, though it contains elements of both. It is a story about ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances and making choices that defined who they were and what they valued. It is a story about the structures of power that enable harm and the individual actions that can disrupt them. It is a story, ultimately, about the importance of looking closely at the world around us and having the courage to respond to what we see. The maid heard footsteps at night. She realized they were waiting for her, and she answered.